So thank you very much for being here. This is a great occasion, and it's not. I'm very happy to say this is not the first time that Enzo Traverso is here at the New School, and I'm pretty sure it will not be the last. And this is I'm pretty sure. But and it's a great occasion to discuss what I think, and I'm sure we will all agree that this is a very important book that asks very important questions, and hopefully we will ask him also other questions today, and also inquire into his answers to these questions. Enzo Traverso is the author of many books. I will read the titles of a couple of them. They have been translated into more than 10 languages, to my count, according to my accounting. And more formally, he is the Susan and Barton Vinokur Professor in the Humanities at Cornell University. He is the author of, I will mention a couple of them for you to get, the range of topics that Professor Traverso has been working on so far. The titles of the books are The End of Jewish Modernity, History of a Conservative Turn, which was published in French in 2013, and in Spanish, Italian, and German last year and the previous year, and I hope we could have an English version pretty soon. It's a very important book. He's also the author of History as a battlefield, interpreting violences of the 20th century, published in French and then in Italian, Spanish, and forthcoming in German and Polish, and hopefully in English soon. And then the past ways of using it, History, Memory, Politics, published in French, Spanish, Italian, German, and Turkish. And one of my favorites, The Origins of Nazi Violence.
Doesn't matter too.
Give a list of it. No, I'm giving a range. Well, okay. So my colleague is asking me to be brief. I could continue, but I want to mention one of my favorites, which is The Origins of Nazi Violence, which is a really important book for thinking modernity, to say the least, and many other topics. Regarding now, we have assigned 10 minutes to every speaker. I guess I will now have to subtract probably 3 minutes from my presentation, and I will be very brief. This book I have read, I have to say, in Spanish before, a couple of years ago, and it's finally in English, in a version that is really crystal clear. It's a great translation, and I have to say I will be teaching it very soon, and and the students, I'm sure they will find this crystal clear English as a great asset of the book. This is a book which is extremely ambitious, and the title is Fire and Blood, the European Civil War, 1914-1945. And it's very ambitious insofar as it really wants to, and in many ways it does, provide an explanation for, I would say, converging context in European history and to some extent in other places as well, although the book restrains itself to some extent to Europe, and I will argue that actually that applies to the areas, for example, that I know more, like in America. There are many ways in which this book could be and is very helpful for thinking these different contexts outside of Europe. But Professor Traverso is talking about Europe, and the idea here is that that it's important to go back to a context which, in a way, is very different to our own. Now, what is interesting in this argument is that this is not a historicist argument. That is to say, that is not saying that we should not connect past and present. But basically what Traverso is saying is that we should think about the past and the present in ways which involve the history of ideology. What do I mean by this, or to put it differently, what does he mean by this? And this is, of course, my interpretation of your book. But I think you suggest this is that basically there are many ways in which we are not understanding what went on in the first 50 years of the 20th century, because the process that came after that presented a kind of de-ideologization that in a way provides too much of a bracket between what happened before and after. What do I mean by that? That in a current context of, let's say, so-called or self-prescribed as post-ideological. That is to say that the debates about ideas are not important. The book is showing that that there is an explanation not only for that is to say for this so-called post-ideological state, which can be explained in terms of what happened before 45 and after 45, but also that important ideas were debated in 45 and then cannot be explained in terms of this post-ideological paradigm, which, by the way, is extremely conservative. Now, to get it into a more specific, I'm being too general here, and to get it into a more specific contextual reading, one of the main points in the book is that that the discussions that happened before 45, a moment in which, as you know, and Professor Traverso explains very well and very contextually, it was very hard not to choose sides. In other words, it was very hard not to be post-ideological or not to have an ideology, because the choices were with fascism or against fascism. Now, after 45 and up to the present, there is a strong tendency among many historians to explain that this choice, in a way, was a false choice. It was, as Furet, one of perhaps the most famous historian of them, but he has many American disciples and pupils. The idea was that this was an illusion insofar as this discussion was a discussion among authoritarians. Either people that were on the side of the fascists or people that were against fascism without knowing that they were also for authoritarianism. This is one of the post-ideological paradigms. That is to say, and one of the connections between that and the present is that whenever you talk about ideological politics, be careful because you might be totalitarian or authoritarian. So this is a very conservative argument that is being done in many ways. So let's talk about, for example, the ecology of Nazism, or the dangers the dangers related to these totalitarian views of space in Nazism. And in that sense, this is a kind of conservative take that is happening in America. Now, Traverso wants to go back and wants us to go back to these ideological discussions to see, how, in a way, that context was a context in which you could not really be apathic towards politics. And in a way, he's showing us that at least among intellectuals, eventually that became such a situation that we can even call it part of the Weltanschauung of the times. That it will be hard, let's say by 1941 or 1939, to find an intellectual that says, I have nothing to do with this, I don't care whether it's the fascists or the anti-fascists. I mean, so this is very important. Because after that, what happens after 45, and he also explains this, particularly in the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, basically what happens is the ideological process in which this context is turning to, let's say, state ideologies in a very different way. What was a discussion among intellectuals, not among states. Was a discussion among intellectuals becomes party in the East, in the places of real socialism, anti-fascism becomes ossified, and now it is finally presented as the particular identification with the states. On the other side of the curtain, in a way, anti-fascism becomes stigmatized as communist. So this is a kind of different thing that happened after 45. One of the results of this reading, according to Traverso, is the present, in which we finally arrive, because of these historical paradigms, we arrive at an era in which supposedly the most progressive position is to be post-ideological and not authoritarian by not engaging with political discussions and political ideas. I mean, so this is very important in the text, and at least, I think this is one of the key ways to read this. Now, I will add 4 more things and then I will shut up. One of them is that the context of this book, and this is another, and I take this from other reading of Professor Traverso. I mean, not this book, but another place in which he says, well, if you think about Paris in the current times and in the last 20 years, Paris became the capital of anti-communism, more than other places. And this is with Furet and other characters. And in this context, what Traverso wanted to do, this is my interpretation, but this is present in many of his work. What he wanted to do is to say, well, there needs to be a historical discussion about the meaning of anti-communism, the meaning of communism, and the meaning of fascism at different times. And in a way, I mean, he shows this in this book, and in a way he shows that this, I will say now in a very blunt way, I mean, which is I will try not to be that blunt, but in a way, as an historian, when you think about these conservative historians that are doing this with history, I mean, and as he put it, this is extremely anachronic or anachronistic. That for us historians, this is the ultimate, in a way, the ultimate insult. So it is really interesting how ideological canonization process work in history in such a way in which you have, Furet and many others presented as the ultra historians when they are doing a very lousy job historiographically speaking. Forget the ideological dimension. Of course, as Traverso shows, Furet is purely driven or mostly driven by that ideological dimension. So this is one of the topics. The other topic is more, I would say, in terms of the way in which this book was written. I mean, it's to simply put it beautiful, because it's basically different topics and how, I mean, different important topics in each section are presented and are analyzed in their extremely thick and condensed, contextual nature. So it's really a great way to read this, and there are not many books produced in this way. I was thinking of Hoswan, or perhaps Perry Anderson, but there are not many books now in the current monographical present in which, we have, I'm not criticizing monographies, I'm the author of one, at least, but the problem is that we have lost that kind of all, and great style of historiography, in which we address big topics, and we think them really in terms of the politics of the past and the present. Now, in a way, I think that this book, with as well as the origins of Nazi violence, returns to that tradition and renews it. So this is, in terms of the relationship between context and aesthetics. The last thing I would like to say is that you might think that this is, and I was really thinking about this, in my first reading, because I read this book twice. In my first reading, I thought that this book was really about fascism and communism, and the relationship between the two, in terms of important, central, key distinctions, but also important, what Professor Traverso presents as symmetries. Symmetries, of course, are not to be understood as conflations, but really the context of the times in which people that are, in a way, at the antipodes, such as, for example, Walter Benjamin and Carl Schmitt, they are kind of taking different political conclusions, but they are thinking, or sometimes, obviously they are thinking in the same context. And this is something important in the book. But I was saying, and I will finish with this, I thought that this was really about that, and it is really about that. This is really about the meaning, the changing meanings of communism and fascism, and the meaning of anti-fascism. But another thing, which is central in the book, and is central to our current post-ideological or so-called post-ideological age, is a discussion about what liberalism is. I mean, and this is also, perhaps a more implicit, but certainly equally important part of the book, because, reading this book, you get a better historical take on the meaning and the history of liberalism, particularly in the current age where liberalism is presented as something which is certainly something without a history. So can we think of liberalism and the constitution of liberalism and modern liberal democracy after 45 without the liberal alliance with communism? And Traverso says we cannot. We need to pay attention to this fact and how these histories, in a way, are connected and yet they are different. So I will stop there.
I will make three comments on the book, and I'm not an historian by training, so my comments will be more on the conceptual aspects of the book. The first comment clearly is about what, in my view, is one of the greatest achievements of the book, and this has to do with what Federico was just saying. And then I have two more specific observations, one of which is more critical. So I'm already announcing that the critique will arrive. So starting from what I think the great achievement of the book is that Traverso sets for himself a double and very difficult task in the book, in the sense that on the one hand, he wants to resist what Federico was mentioning, so some historiographic tendency to actually ideologically conflate and equate fascism and communism along the lines of the coincidence of the opposites, or by using the category of totalitarianism as a very vague category that basically conflates different historical phenomena and also different political projects. On the other hand, he also wants to resist the temptation to end up in an apologetic attitude towards the revolutionary side. So towards communism, and communism understood not just as Soviet communism, but the whole revolutionary Marxist and anarchist, anarcho-communist tradition. And in order to do this, in my view, the main theoretical move of the book that allows him to actually keep together these two intents, so resisting the conflation between fascism and communism, at the same time not being apologetic towards, for example, some phenomena of violence and horror related to the revolutionary experience in the 20th century. He does this by indicating the 30 years long civil war, the common soil for both revolution and counter-revolution. So in other words, the long European civil war is the theoretical tool, interpretive tool that allows him, first of all, to interpret the two total wars as part of the long civil war, so and as combining different forms of war, wars of the extermination, colonial wars, patriotic wars, and local civil wars. But also, the European civil war is the terrain of the revolutions and counter-revolutions in Russia, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and to a certain extent in Italy. So this age of iron and fire is what somehow creates the common soil for revolution and counter-revolution, and explains precisely the similarities that Federico was also mentioning, and explains also some phenomena such as the demilitarization of revolutionary politics, or the tendency to militarize militant politics. At the same time, precisely because we are speaking about a civil war, clearly the two sides cannot be really equated, cannot be conflated. In other words, they represent precisely two diametrically opposed, incompatible solutions to the European crisis. Now, with this conceptual schema that allows him precisely to accomplish the double task I mentioned at the beginning, then Traverso investigates the explosions of violence, especially in chapter 2, Anatomy of Civil War, within the long 30 years, but especially during the two total wars. And he does this by distinguishing between hot violence and cold violence. And one of the main arguments of chapter 2, the Anatomy of Civil War, is precisely that seemingly anachronistic forms of violence, as transgressive, as dictated and motivated by passions such as hatred and fear, degenerating into cruelty and so on, combined with industrially and rationally organized violence, such as mass bombings, including cultural bombing, and the gas chambers. And in contrast to Norbert Elias, Traverso is very careful in distinguishing these two kinds of violence, so not conflating them, and interpreting the Holocaust, so the gas chambers, as the expression of a barbarism that is inscribed in the principle of civilization, so in a certain form of, so not as an irrational savagery, but rather as the other side of the coin of modern civilization. Now, at the same time, I think, if I correctly understand his thesis in chapter 2, Traverso does adopt Elias' interpretation of hot violence as a regression in the process of civilization, and as the evaporation of control over our drives, the explosion of the cultural and social constraints molding our norms of behavior. And here, my critical observation comes. In other words, I would like to pause a moment about the notional drive, and my question is whether this is actually the category that helps us understanding this phenomenon of hot violence, to use the term you use. So in other words, whether we should really adopt a Freudian-inspired schema in order to understand this forms of transgressive violence that were combining in a non-contemporary way with cold violence. And one of the concerns I have is that this may lead us to omit some ideas about human nature that we do not necessarily need to actually accomplish the theoretical task that you are setting for yourself in the book. I will just make an example. Traverso compares civil war to carnival from the viewpoint of transgressive violence. So carnival where routine is broken and what is traditionally forbidden is allowed. But carnival is precisely not a state of nature. It is actually precisely, carnival necessitates the presence of the law, because it is the transgression of the law. Carnival doesn't come before the law. It is not a natural state before the law. It is a transgression of the existing law that becomes norm for a day or for a week and so on. So what I'm suggesting is whether we should actually perhaps privilege a different approach in which we do not have explosions of uncontrolled violence and passions of hatred and so on because social norms are collapsing, but rather because other forms of social norms or orders, political orders are taking place that actually stimulate and create these very passions, so that these are not natural passions that then come up. And I think that this alternative approach may be more coherent with Traverso's sympathy, or what I interpret as a sympathy towards Schmidt's reinterpretation of Hobbes' state of nature as civil war. So Schmidt's politicization of Hobbes' state of nature, so that we do not really have a state of nature at all. The Hobbes' state of nature is civil war, which means it is political already. And the second observation is, if I still have time, is more of a question, in the sense that, as I said at the beginning, Traverso explains some aspects of revolutionary politics on the basis of this common soil of the European Civil War. For example, he refers to Gramsci's adoption of military language to actually articulate political strategy through the distinction between war of position and war of movement. And he also refers to the adoption of a certain military aesthetics. We may speak about, for example, the myth of the armed revolutionary, partisan, or rebel, the notion of revolution as a final confrontation with the enemy, so comparable precisely to war and so on. Now, these are features that shape the revolutionary left also after the war, but that, according to Traverso, should be traced back to the cultural, political, and social context of the European Civil War. So somehow, the militarization, a certain militarization of militant revolutionary politics in the 70s, for example, still is a remnant of the fact that revolutionary politics was shaped in this, was molded in this way during the years of the European Civil War. Now, if this is correct, then my question would be then, what are the theoretical political conclusions we should draw from this? Because you clearly do not do this in the book. In other words, the book provides this reconstruction and this very strong interpretation. But then, what are the conclusions we should draw on a political theoretical level? One possible conclusion might be that then the Russian Revolution, for example, cannot be taken as a model. In other words, as a blueprint for revolutionary politics today, so that this is not a form of revolution that we can repeat today. And this would imply that then, if the context in which this form of revolutionary politics took place, it was related to the European Civil War, if this context is overcome, then we should perhaps radically rethink what it means, what revolutionary politics can mean today. So this is a question I ask you, whether this is actually one of the conclusions you want to draw and you do not draw in the book. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I said in the sense that this is a great book that tries, I think it's one of the best books of the anti-Furet orientation, and it was time at least to start deconstructing the Furet illusion and to rehabilitate anti-fascism, and it's a really rewarding work, and this is political history at its best. Now, I have some questions that are predominantly will point at some marginal or more minor issues, but the most fundamental, one of the most fundamental questions is the idea of the European Civil War. The question that I have is whether this description is a phenomenological one or an ontological, because obviously it was not a civil war in the sense that the conflicts erupted within a single unitary political community under a kind of unitary state, but the terms that you are using is that they assumed this great war from 1914 to 1945-46 assumed features associated with the civil war, or that it had elements that appear in civil war. So the question is, was it something that we cannot really identify as traditional wars among states, but on the other hand, it was not a civil war in the strict ontological definition that it requires a common political association that splits into two. So my question is whether, this is the first aspect, whether the term European Civil War carries with it a metaphorical dimension rather than a purely descriptive one. And this brings me to the second, is why to emphasize so much the European dimension if one wants to emphasize civil war? Why not to say, for example, that it was a Eurocentric, global civil war that started, let's say, on the European soil, but it engulfed the whole planet in a global kind of dimension that starts. That will be to start with Lenin, the idea of Schmittian, and then to go and to discuss also a post-colonial perspective, in the sense that many anti-colonial thinkers understood that war as the internalization of colonial practices that were exercised overseas in the overseas colonies coming back into the European continent. So in that sense, if there is also a kind of colonial dimension, both in the First World War, but also in the second, of the techniques adopted, because you tend to, in several places, to describe how colonial practice of colonial wars were also introduced, like the civilian, the lack of a distinction between combatants and civilians, for instance, then maybe it will be more useful to decide the global reach of this, rather than to limit it into the European continent. The third aspect related to this definition or description of the European Civil War has to do with the question of periodization. That's always a complex issue. Where does it start and where does it end? The Greek Civil War ended in 1949. The fascist dictatorships of Spain and Portugal end in the beginning of the 70s, along with the Greek dictators as well. 73, 74, 75, we have the collapse of this, let's say, semi-fascist dictatorships. So one might say that the Civil War really didn't end, the European Civil War, if it was a European Civil War, didn't end really in 46, but maybe continue until 49, or even the anti-colonial wars of independence are part of it. Or maybe the last European dictatorships are signifying the end of that war. And then what might be the outcome of this European Civil War? Fascism was defeated, anti-fascism was dissolved, because it was replaced and displaced by anti-totalitarian. So someone won this war, probably the liberals, that in fact they were not the fundamental parties fighting it. So someone else fought the war, someone else was defeated, and someone else won, if there is someone who won. But it seems to me that it's a paradoxical outcome for a civil war. Usually civil war is one part of the contending rivals who wins. Here everybody lost, and those who didn't really fight it won. So this is because it might complicate the picture a little bit more of this civil war and its periodization itself. Maybe the Cold War is also a continuation of that global European civil war, but now fought by proxies in other territories. So what we might understand the Cold War as doing what colonial powers traditionally did, to shift the violence again in the so-called formal independent states that they were not really independent in most of the case, but economically dependent. So this is the broader questions about the concept of European civil war, both in a political and in historical terms. Now, two more specific issues. The one has to do with the question of dictatorship, the other has to do with the Holocaust. So it is true that on the question of dictatorship, as you mentioned, someone might argue that there has been a transformation, that for the first time dictatorship in these civil wars becomes a regime form, a state form. It's not anymore a temporary suspension or a kind of constitutional device to face crisis. I'm not sure that we can really see such a discontinuity, although this is a huge debate, because one of the main characteristic logics of dictatorship is precisely what was characteristic also of the new form of dictatorship you are mentioning. That has to do with self-preservation, order against disorder, safety against sedition and conflict, patriotism, sacrifice. So the dictator is someone who will sacrifice for the common good, is a patriotic office, the best, the more civic, more virtuous citizen will become the Roman dictator. So my question is whether we can understand this fight also in terms in terms of a common conceptual and symbolic space of dictatorship. That we had different conflicts around different interpretations and enactments or performances of dictatorial politics. The one that was considered to be of the proletarians, the others that were considered to be of the race, and the third that was considered to be the constitutional protection of liberal individual rights. So what might characterize also a uniqueness of this European civil war, it was that dictatorship was the master concept and what was at stake, although in the end it seems that only the liberal version survived, like in theories, but also in practice of constitutional dictatorship in Western liberal constitutions. So this is a kind of a different understanding I have of the conceptual and political history of dictatorship. Not a break in that moment, but a further evolution of the concept and the practice. After all, for me, it might be the case that the European Civil War was a kind of neo-Roman Republican war in its different variations. Now, the Holocaust, this very a complicated issue. I sense the kind of tension of your argument, because in the end, correctly, but also throughout the book, you argue that the Holocaust was not really understood as a unique phenomenon in this kind of European civil war, but as an accidental occurrence that didn't attract the attention of historians, but much later. So that it's not specific, it does not have the centrality that you try to emphasize in the case of histories of the European Civil War. But then my question is whether you fall into the same trap, because if the European wars were civil wars, it means that genocides and Holocaust should be a phenomenological characteristic of all civil wars. If it's not a characteristic of all civil wars, it means that this civil war is something unique. The Holocaust and the extermination of a whole people. So here I think we are facing a kind of dilemma. Either it is a civil war like all other civil wars, and then all civil wars have to exhibit forms of genocide and Holocaust, or it's something unique to the civil war, and therefore it might not be a civil war because it has some additional elements like the Holocaust that do not appear as attributes of all the other civil wars. Because your main argument is that the European Civil War is a civil war because it has all the elements of what we associate with a civil war. So my question to you is, do you think that the Holocaust was unique to the civil war, or is characteristic of all civil wars? And what exactly these two positions, how they can be reconciled? And the last point is about, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a historian, I'm interested more in the political relevance of ideas. So it made me think about what might be the prospects of anti-fascism today, after also reading your piece about Europe. So totalitarianism, the anti-totalitarian obsession is over, more or less. The Soviet communism is over at the same time. The extreme right is back, xenophobia, racism are back in Europe. So do you think that maybe this rehabilitation of anti-fascism, you can move this rehabilitation a step further and argue that is what might be the most hopeful and useful strategy and political discourse today, at least in the European continent, that by recovering and rehabilitating anti-fascism, maybe the left can finally wake up, find again its energy in the case of refugees, in the case of anti-capitalist struggles, because it doesn't have anymore the right-wing criticism of anti-totalitarianism to supplement it. It doesn't face the Soviet, let's say, negative that can be absorbed by it. So the final question that this book brought into my mind is whether anti-fascism can be resurrected as a new way of unifying the continent and taking it in, saving it, in fact, from the abyss that it's facing now.
I only found out I was doing this, yesterday, I guess. I read the book when it came out in French, which is about 5 years ago.
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Well, I didn't read it 10 years ago. Yeah, no, I did read it when it came out. But I remember it very well. It's a terrific book. It's a wonderful book, and it influenced my thinking. And I'll say also that I'm better prepared to talk about this book than I am about Schmidt tomorrow, though I'm on the program because I've never read Schmidt. But in any event, I basically have 4 points picking up on the comments that other people have made. So first of all, going back to Federico's situating the book, it's really, for most of the 20th century, or certainly for most of the period of my lifetime, from going, let's say, after World War II until well into the late 20th century, you basically had to understand the 20th century in terms of the conflict between fascism and communism. And you basically had to take the side of saying that communism had the right, was better. With it, everybody knew that communism was terrible, had done all of these terrible things, and so forth. But basically, there was a good side and a bad side to the 20th century. And the good side was communism, was the left, and communism was a sort of aberration of the left. And the bad side was fascism. This was sort of the common sense of the 20th century. And Enzo's book, as I read it, is rejecting that. So I think the target of Enzo's book is not Fourier, but rather someone like Hobsbawm, for whom that is still the central organizing thing. I mean, there's nothing negative about Hobsbawm. That's a great argument to make about the 20th century. But I felt that Enzo's book is moving beyond that and trying to give us a new way to understand this question, of how do you move beyond that communism versus fascism is so central. And I felt that Enzo was trying to move beyond that. And the way that he was trying to move beyond it, as I read the book, is quintessentially historical. And that was not that quintessentially historical in the sense that what distinguishes history is trying to understand things as the people themselves of that past period understood it, trying to get into the mindset that other people had at that particular time. And he really got me into the mindset of fascists and people caught in the middle and people making a commitment and so forth. So I really had a feeling when I read the book of that it really could not be reduced to good guys versus bad guys, that there were bad guys on both sides, there were good guys on both sides, and I thought that was a really great achievement of the book. I don't know, I can't think of other books that did that for that particular question. Now, the way that Federico situated the book in terms of the historiographical, intellectual context in which the book appears, I agree with Federico's situating of it, except that the turning point in the whole understanding of the conflict between communism and fascism is not really after 1945, it's in the 1970s. What happened in the 1970s that Enzo's book speaks to is that we lost the concept of fascism. and this is actually speaks to Andreas's suggestion. We lost the concept of fascism. Fascism was a very important concept, and I'm not saying it was an adequate concept. It was a very important concept because it told you something about capitalism in the thinking up until the 1970s, when we basically lost that concept. It became meaningless, or this is fascistic or something like that. It lost its specificity. But fascism, as it functioned up until the 1970s, was telling you something about capitalism, and was telling you something about the United States. Franklin Roosevelt said the American South, the Jim Crow system, is fascistic. And that, there was something about the concept. We replaced the concept of fascism with not we, they, the dominant elites, the liberal elites that, the people who create the common sense of our time. They replaced the concept of fascism with the concept of totalitarianism. And they tried to equate communism and fascism and so forth, the way that Fiore does and so forth. But as I say, Enzo's book it goes beyond a criticism of Fiore, because he's actually also rejecting the communist-fascist dichotomy that Fiore is also rejecting. That's my second point, the situating of the book historiographically. Now, my third point is, what is the underlying theory of the book? And here, I was not sure, and I may not be fair to it because I read it a while ago and so forth, but I did not, what was convincing and powerful to me was the experience that people went through at that time, that it could not be understood in terms of good versus bad. I really got that. But what is the underlying? Do you have an explanation for this fight between communism and fascism that is an alternative to basically the kind of explanation Hobsbawm or the old Marxist explanation and so forth? I do not believe that the concept of the Europeans, I do not believe it was a European Civil War. I don't agree. I don't think it's a useful concept. Insofar as it was, and it should be understood as and by that I mean the two world wars. I don't think that they should be understood. That whole period, 1914 to 45, that the book treats, I don't think should be understood in terms of a European Civil War. Insofar as you want an intra-European framework for it, it's the German problem. It's still the same problem that is animating Europe today. It was the rise of Germany, the place of Germany in the intra-European state system. But from the very beginning, World War I and World War II, as Andreas says, it was a global war. It was a global war, and here I have had many discussions with Enzo through the years, and Enzo is, so lovable because for many reasons, but one of which is he's so European, and he knows all the European languages, he knows the European traditions, he knows the literature and all of the different European intellectual traditions, and so forth. What about America? I've often said to Enzo, I said, come to Cornell because you'll learn something about America. And then what about the rest of the world, as Andreas is bringing out? You can't separate the so-called European Civil War from, let's say, the Russo-Japanese, the Japanese defeat of Russia, which brought all of the so-called colored peoples and so forth onto the world stage. Persia, the breakup of the Ottoman, India, the anti-colonial movements. This is all part of World War I. I mean, World War II. Can't even begin. And the United States, a book that I think is really, really good book that, like yours, pushes us forward is Adam Tooze's book, The Deluge. And he brings out what is happening in Europe at that time is, as Hobsbawm would say, the rise of the masses, the rise of the left, the demands of women, the demands of trade unions, and so forth, but also the centrality of the United States. Everybody is thinking about the United States. The Germans, the English, and so forth. And of course, it's so obvious in World War II, but it's also true in World War I. Everybody is thinking of the United States because it's so overwhelmingly powerful economically, and what it is like the huge elephant. What it does is going to shape everything. So I don't find the concept of the European Civil War a useful concept. A concept that I like is on Omea's concept. It's also very undeveloped. That's the general crisis of the 20th century, the idea of a general crisis, and it's a global crisis. To me, that is a better starting point. And I think that this crisis has everything to do with the rise of with the Second Industrial Revolution and the rise of a new kind of capitalism that creates this huge proletariat and mass democracy, the mass media, and so forth. And finally, I'll just flag the last point that Andreas raised, which I don't have an answer to, but I think the question, I don't think that the European Civil War is a civil war over dictatorship, but I think the question of dictatorship, this is an age of dictatorships. This is an age in which dictators are using mass media to create a certain kind of image, to organize mass publics. That's how these states are being brought into existence. So I do think the question of dictatorship is crucial to understanding this period, but I'm not sure what else I would have to say about that.
Thank you. So now, Professor.
Yeah. But first of all, thank you very much for organizing this discussion about my book. I'm very happy to be here and to discuss with you. And thank you very much for your critical reading of my book. I think it is impossible to answer all your questions and critiques. I will try to gather different questions and to answer some of them because you raise very crucial points and very big questions. I think that it's impossible to answer in a few minutes.
15 to be precise.
50. Well, so first of all, in order to avoid misunderstandings, because I observed that my book was criticized in different countries where it has been translated, and sometimes it has been criticized considering it as a kind of history of Europe or as a kind of history of the 20th century. This is not the ambition of this book. The ambition of this book is much more limited. This book, the purpose of this book is to analyze critically a new relationship between violence, politics, and culture that appears in Europe between the two world wars. And of course, the history of Europe in the first half of the 20th century cannot be dissociated from world history. But my ambition wasn't to write a history of the 20th century or a history of Europe in the first half of the 20th century. The purpose was much more limited and particular. So that's the reason for which in this book I don't speak about, I don't analyze very important questions like the role of the United States in the global crisis of international relations in the first half of the 20th century. This is the reason for which I don't analyze the question of colonialism or the question, a very crucial question of the crisis of capitalism. So the ambition of this book is much more limited. But I wrote this book because and the idea of this book was born in the 90s, because I was very disturbed by, we could say, the zeitgeist there. So this way of thinking created by the end of the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so at the beginning of the 21st century, dominated an interpretation of the past century in name of, as the age of violence and totalitarianism. And we entered a post-totalitarian and post-ideological era. So I was extremely disturbed by a dominant historiographical tendency which depicted the history of the 20th century as the century of violence, and the century put under the sign of totalitarianism. And my purpose was to criticize this commonplace, this ideological and apologetical view, because after the age of totalitarianism we entered the age of liberal democracy as the end of history, and so on and so on. So I simply observed that it is anachronistic, and it is historiographically speaking absolutely not pertinent at all. So to project retrospectively on the first half of the 20th century some categories of, so we could say, of a post-totalitarian wisdom. So the tendency was very strong to interpret the first half of the 20th century with its revolutions and counter-revolutions, its social and political conflicts, so projecting retrospectively on this age, some categories belonging to our age. So Habermas, Bobbio, Rawls, and so it doesn't work in order to analyze, to interpret a time which produced political thinkers like, so on the left, Gramsci, Trotsky, Lenin, and on Lukács, and on the right, so Schmidt, for instance, or Gentile, Junger. So I simply tried to historicize this time and to understand the way of thinking and the political cultures of that time. Why? So how this very controversial concept of European civil war. Eli doesn't like it. Andreas pointed out many limits.
I like that.
I like it.
I use this concept in a phenomenological, not in an ontological way. And I'm not the first to use this concept. Unfortunately, this concept had been popularized by Ernst Nolte. This formula, this idea, the European crisis of the first half of the 20th century as the age of the European Civil War. This formula was used by fascists and Marxists. Was used by Trotsky and Lenin, was used by Churchill and by political thinkers, statesmen, but very few historians or scholars in general, or political theoreticians tried to conceptualize the European Civil War. And I recognize and I emphasize that in my book that this concept is an aporetic concept. Because so if we work with the concept of war and civil war, every undergrad of Andreas could explain to us that there is a very clear difference between war, which is a rupture of the international relations, which is a conflict between sovereign states, and civil war, which is an internal conflict, of course. But the problem is that the two world wars, and in general, we could say all the conflicts of the first half of the 20th century, from the First World War to the Second World War, passing through the civil wars in Central Europe at the end of the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. So all the conflicts of this age cannot be understood, cannot be interpreted with our classical or conventional categories of political theory. The wars of this time doesn't fit with into the classical Clausewitz definition of war, so it's something different. And there are wars growingly, increasingly fought as civil war, or like civil wars, in which there are no longer shared rules by the belligerents. And these are typical features of civil wars as a concept which seems to me pertinent and useful in order to define a sequence, a historical cycle, a sequence of conflicts, a sequence of crisis put under the sign of war. But of course, each step in this sequence has its own peculiarities, its own profile. We could very well investigate the Spanish Civil War as a conflict with its own roots in Spanish history and so on and so on. But globally speaking, I think that we can put all conflicts of this era in Europe under this label, perhaps, so to speak. But I recognize that it is an aporetic definition. We cannot speak of a European civil war as if it have existed a European state. Today, a European state doesn't exist. That's obvious, and that's the reason also for which I adopt a clear periodization. So, if we adopt another perspective, or if we analyze the same problem from a different observatory, of course we should adopt a different periodization. If we analyze the same age from a colonial perspective. So perhaps the cleavages, the temporal cleavages, the periodization should change. And also if we adopt an American observatory. So that's obvious. Civil war is I tried to define civil war far beyond political theory. Civil war is an historical experience which, of course, can be conceptualized with the tools offered by political theory, but civil wars are historical experiences including ideologies, politics, conflicts, cultures, emotions. So are moments of eruption of violence pushed by ideologies, but also by feelings, emotions, cultures in the broadest meaning of the word. And so I think that I try to use this concept of civil war in these not only political but more broadly speaking, so historical, anthropological sense. And from this point of view, so I established a difference between cold violence and hot violence. So perhaps putting the problem in different terms, perhaps we could very well apply to this time and to the violence of this period the concept suggested by Ernst Bloch of Ungleichzeitigkeit. Ungleichzeitigkeit, so discrepancy of temporalities. An era in which coexist and conflate forms of violence belonging to different historical temporalities, but which experience a new synchronicity. So, in order to explain that by concrete and clear examples. So, on the one hand, and in order also to go beyond the narrow borders of Europe, because so on the one hand we have in Los Alamos the scholars, scientific who work in order to create the atomic bomb, the most powerful brains of the time concentrated in these. And on the other hand, but at the same moment, we have in the jungle in American soldiers who put as war trophies the schools of the Japanese killed soldiers in their vehicles. We have on the one hand the engineers of the top company who work on the construction of crematoria able to endure, to resist very high temperatures, and so the extermination camps with so we could say this productive and managerial rationality, which is typical of modernity of the 20th century, and the Einsatzgruppen who organized the Partisanenkampf, which is a kind of manhunt conceived in so terms of medieval practices. So, and both kind of violence coexist and merge in a very peculiar way. Of course, we could give other examples in the second half of the 20th century in Asia, for instance, the Vietnam War, or more recently in Iraq. And of course, this is not. I wouldn't try to singularize this period, but so I think that there is something peculiar and which defines the profile of a time. So the time of the European Civil War, I have some minutes more, so created also a military paradigm of revolution. That's so it's a crucial point in my view, not only for historiographical reasons, but also for biographical. And I belong to a generation who discovered politics and a political commitment thinking to social and political transformation, thinking to revolution in military terms. So, and that could take sometimes also very dangerous consequences, or that could be a kind of masquerade and caricature in other circumstances. But it was impossible in the 60s, in the 70s, to think to European revolution or without assume this military paradigm that was a legacy of the age of the European Civil War. And I think that this legacy hasn't, until now, been meditated and elaborated. So we didn't pass through this experience. It was rejected, it was stigmatized, it was sometimes anachronistically perpetuated with very, very bad consequences. We have to go beyond this legacy, but we have also to elaborate this experience. And it's, of course, it's not at all an easy task. But so I think that writing this book on the European Civil War was a dimension of an intellectual and political work in which I'm committed, like many other scholars belonging to my generation. Towards more. Okay. I perhaps in this book I devoted limited. I pay attention to the Holocaust, not superficially, I hope, but this is not central in the book because I had previously written other books on the Holocaust, but one of the purposes of the book on this topic is to criticize some historiographical tendencies which created the Holocaust studies as a discipline. So the Holocaust in the last decades has been investigated, analyzed, interpreted, reconstructed in every details, we could say, but as we could say as an endogenous process, as an endogenous process. So the Holocaust has been interpreted as an event per se, as an autonomous event. And that was certainly a kind of reaction to a previous silence recovering this historical experience. But this focus on the uniqueness of the Holocaust, the historical singularity of the Holocaust, the centrality of the Holocaust, the Second World War, the Holocaust as so a kind of overwhelming dimension of the Second World War. I think that this is epistemologically debatable. And I tried to recognize the peculiarities of the Holocaust. The Holocaust, in my view, cannot be assimilated to a form of civil war, for instance. It's something requiring different analytical tools, a different approach. But the Holocaust belongs to this age of, I call it, European civil war. Anyhow, we have to inscribe the Holocaust in this age of violence, and separated from that, it is absolutely ununderstandable. I try to analyze in my book the advent during the First World War of what I call industrial massacre. So during the First World War, Europe, first of all, so, and we could say, perhaps it will be our discussion tomorrow in another conference, that of course there were colonial violence in the 19th century was the background of the total wars of the 20th century, but a new form of violence appears in Europe in 1914, and the world discovers at that time what I call mass anonymous death. And that's something new. Mass anonymous death means a new way of killing. Mass killing, industrial killing, and serialized killing. I speak of the emergence of what I call the Fordist army. So the war is fought in a similar way in which big companies produce. Violence is industrially produced. I use this as a metaphor. So the loss of aura of human life in the battlefields, and as the modern work of art, speaking with Benjamin, becomes mechanically reproducible, so death becomes mechanically reproducible in the battlefields. And that's something new. That's something new. And this is a kind of epiphany. So this change, this historical turn will be irreversible, because that will be followed by other wars. So the question of anti-fascism, and I finish with that. So one of the purposes of my book is to rehabilitate, so anti-fascism, to reject and to criticize a very widespread tendency today to assimilate anti-fascism. So the scheme is a kind of syllogism. Anti-fascism is equal to communism, communism is equal to totalitarianism, and by consequence, anti-fascism is a dimension of totalitarianism. So of course, I defend the legacy and the tradition of anti-fascism, but I think that also that we have to historicize anti-fascism, and this attempt to historicize anti-fascism inevitably means a critical approach to the history and the tradition of anti-fascism. And I point out in my book many contradictions shaping the history of anti-fascism. And I agree with Eli. So anti-fascism cannot be reduced to a political option or to an ideology. What was something? So I think that we could interpret that as well as that words carnival. So we could anthropologically analyze anti-fascism. Anti-fascism was an ethos, a shared ethos, was a reason for a political commitment transcending ideologies, transcending partisan politics. And this is the legacy of anti-fascism. I defend this tradition, this legacy. We have to rediscover it. I'm very skeptical with respect to some tendencies or temptations quite spread today, particularly in Greece and in other European countries, to reproduce old schemes and to present the situation today as a situation in which we should organize again an anti-fascist movement like in the 30s. I think that would be misunderstanding of the present situation for different reasons, not because I neglect the dangers of the rise of neo-fascist movements, but first of all, I think that our enemy, so to speak, preceding our conference on Schmidt tomorrow. So our enemy today is neoliberalism and not fascism. And secondly, I think that we are facing today post-fascist movements, so nationalist, radical nationalists movements, xenophobic nationalisms, post-fascist movements, but we cannot fight against these new forms of political xenophobia and nationalism, reproducing old models. Anti-fascist struggle in the 30s. We are not facing fascist dictatorships. So also these categories of dictatorship, state of exception, sovereignty, enshrinement. What is the enshrinement? What is the embodiment of these forms of the decisionism today? So I don't think that a mechanical transposition of political categories of the years between the two world wars would be useful in order to recognize, define, and fight against so I stop here because I spoke too much, and sorry for my...
Since there are no other hands. No, I don't mean to hog on the concept of the European Civil War, but I do think it's important because you have a critical attitude toward all these other concepts, and I don't think you have a critical attitude toward the concept of Europe. And it's not a matter of saying, the U.S. played a role or something like that, or Asia played a role or something like that. That would just be a pedantic point. But the way that you presented what you're doing in the book helps me to see the question that I had about what it means to talk about a European Civil War. Because I do think there was a European Civil War, and I think it's generally understood in a certain way, and that is that the solution to the European Civil War is the EU. That is, there was a civil war. It was centered on France versus Germany. It was internal to these national histories, ethnic histories, identities, all of the hatreds that Europe was caught up in, and then the EU is a solution to that. This is one way of understanding, because a civil war has to do with a reconstruction of a political entity, and in that sense, Europe has a political history and so forth, and there's the EU. But the Spanish Civil War, the Greek Civil War, all of the civil wars that were actually going on at that time that you talk about, were not really concerned with that question. They were concerned with the question of left versus right, socialism versus capitalism, as it was understood in that time. And the real question that your book leads to is, how do we put together these different questions, the question of left versus right and the question of the national things. That was actually the question at that time. People like Hitler were saying the national question trumps the question of left versus right. That's what fascism was. It was a national racial answer to the people who said, no, the basic question is socialism versus capitalism. So I do feel, and your book is such a profound book, I do feel that you're too modest in saying, I'm just showing, and so forth. You do have to push the question of what is the overall framework that we're, have to understand this crisis.
So perhaps we can collect more questions, and please,
I'd like to ask about Britain in this European Civil War, because of all the countries, it was less involved internally with fascism or communism. It sort of stood aside from this conflict you're describing, this new approach to political violence and everything like that. So what is it about Britain that makes it a voice of sanity in this time period that you're talking about?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Eli Zaretsky's question and ask to what extent this concept of European Civil War you offer depends upon a longue durée historical narrative put forward, I think, most influentially, and certainly in your footnotes one sees this by Carl Schmitt as pupils Armin Möller, Roman Schnur, revolving around the kind of myth of 1648, right? So to what extent does the force of your vision of civil war depend upon this notion that, you know, up until, let's say, 1792, and then again through to 1914, war is sort of bracketed, right? It's analogized, as you very vividly described, to a duel theorized by Clausewitz, and then there's this sort of cataclysmic breakthrough. And I wonder whether you defend that narrative, which seems to me to be highly contestable, has been criticized by Benno Teschke and others, or whether perhaps it's sort of kind of heuristic or maybe disposable in the larger frame of your vision of the interwar period.
Nancy?
Yeah, well, I hesitate to say anything since A, I haven't read the book, and B, I came in after this discussion was well advanced. But it's so interesting, what I'm hearing, that I can't resist. I was really struck by the sort of semi-autobiographical statement you made about your generation growing up with these sort of military metaphors of how you change society. And we are, I think, nearly the same age. Maybe I'm a bit older, I don't know. But I also grew up in the New Left without a trace of those metaphors, and just found them absurd and laughable when, you know, certain fringe groups tried to adopt them. And I think this connects to the question about Britain, actually. I'm getting the sense that a big part of what you're calling the European Civil War is about the failure to establish stable, let's say, liberal bourgeois democratic political regimes. And that is why Britain and the US and possibly some, I don't know, Scandinavian countries or whoever, you know, how to tell us, are kind of not, you know, do look different. So, I mean, I'm also, that's one point, just where does that sort of fit in? And if that is right, then I think the second point might have to do with incomplete transition to some form of capitalist bourgeois modernity, or one that is, you know, so difficult and right. And it's, in a way, it's also bringing me back. I like Eli. I'm worried that, from what I've heard anyway, I mean, I take it that the job of the historian is in part what Eli said, to let us understand how what they thought they were doing, how they understood, blah, blah, blah. But that's only step one. Step two is to sort of bring that into relation to understandings that were not available to the people living through it, either for reasons of not having historical distance or because they just are not at the scale of experience, but right, have to do with more impersonal forces that are not immediately accessible experientially. So if that's right, then I think I am back to Eli's question about how feeling the need for some more, let's say, third-person picture of how to frame this within which to situate this experience. And I think for me, just as you said, today's enemy is not fascism but neoliberalism, I would say that the period you're talking about, I would go put a quasi-Polanyian here and say it's the sort of unraveling of the age of liberal capitalism with all of its incomplete transitions, not even, in some places not even stabilized really politically, and that's the context in which both the left versus right struggle, Spain, the Soviet Union, et cetera, Russia rather, and the ethnic struggle, national rivalry, And maybe we could also add, since someone raised the issue about dictatorship, the sort of modernizing dictators, Kemal, et cetera, who are also, have their own genocides on their own. So I mean, there are so many different kinds of conflicts here. I think that what you said about the non-synchronous synchronicity of different technologies and modes of fighting, I think that's fascinating. And in a way, this sort of explains that, because it's the unevenness of modernity across the space, with Britain and the U.S. The U.S. is not Europe, obviously, and there are those who would say Britain isn't either, but if we assume it is, right, that's one sort of kind of modernity. And anyway, these are just random thoughts that you provoked in me. I think it's about the collapse of liberal capitalism and of all the political pathologies that are related to it.
Yep. Yeah, very shortly, briefly, because it's quite late. So thank you for this interesting.
Do you want to hear Andreas?
No. I was sure there were some other questions.
No, we should collect in a second round.
A second round?
Yeah.
I thought...
This is only the first round.
So, okay.
This is how it works at the new school.
Yeah.
We torture our speakers.
Yeah. Yeah. So, first of all, the question of the cleavage between left and right, I think, of course, I assume this cleavage as pertinent. That's obvious, but I inscribe it into this historical context. So the European Civil War is simply a kind of box containing a lot of conflicts, social, political, ideological, wars, but also revolutions and counter-revolutions. And of course, when we analyze or try to interpret revolutions and counter-revolutions, this cleavage between left and right becomes more than pertinent, it becomes absolutely fundamental. But so the framework, the general framework of these conflicts is this age of wars, which I call the European Civil War. But of course, and I accept your criticism, I think, of course, this is, I said, an attempt to interpret this new relationship between violence, politics, and culture in continental Europe. And adopting this approach, this perspective, the UK appears as a marginal country until 1940, because so in 1940 things change and the UK becomes a central actor of this conflict. But once again, this is not a history of Europe in the first, from this point of view. So if we analyze the history of the society, the League of Nations, well, the approach, the analysis should be different. But continental Europe at that moment, much more than the UK, is an interesting place in order to investigate a historical transition. So it's continental Europe, the locus of the collapse of the 19th century political order, the collapse of classical liberalism, and throwing a continent into chaos, into the search of a new political order which will be established only at the end of the Second World War, not in Europe but in a broader context. Of course, the conclusion, the outcome of this European Civil War cannot be interpreted, analyzed exclusively within European borders. That's obvious. But so the starting point of what I call the European Civil War is precisely this translation of the axis of international relations from Europe to the US. So the first consequence of the First World War was the center of the world is no longer Europe, be the US. At the end of the First World War, that's evident. So I analyze, I focus on continental Europe, also apprehending the eclipse of continental Europe from the international scene. Because after the Second World War, continental Europe is a small part of a global world. In 1914, all the European elites think themselves as the masters of the world. So this is a mental landscape which completely changes in this. And from this point of view, it's an interesting locus because Europe, continental Europe in particular, at the edge of the First World War, is a continent of dynasties, of what so Arno Maia calls the persistence of the old regime. So the old regime is the political envelope, and the old regime is the aristocratic states, political regimes shaped by their aristocratic and absolutist origins. Is the envelope of modern mass societies, industrial, capitalist society. And that's also the reason for which the contradictions of these locus become so explosive at that time. And that's also probably the reason for which the most fascinating and audacious attempts to create, to invent new forms of politics appear in continental Europe at that moment. Certainly not in the UK. Speaking of aesthetical avant-garde, political avant-garde, the theories of revolution, and also the reason for which I don't know. So. Perhaps tomorrow we will speak about that. Carl Schmitt writes his book on dictatorship in 1919, and it's a book which records a deep, radical transformation in the perception of this very old, ancient political institution. But dictatorship at the end of the First World War means something different with respect to its previous meaning. Anyhow, cannot be simply old conceptions cannot be simply reproduced. And this distinction, this canonical distinction between commissarial and sovereign dictator appears at that moment. So the dictatorship's charismatic politics. So continental Europe, much more than the UK or the US at that moment, is a laboratory of new experiences, of new projects, new ideas. And that for a moment, of course, after 1945. things change, but I wish to focus on these extremely tragic, violent, apocalyptic, but also enormously creative from an aesthetic, cultural, and political point of view. So, so with respect to this idea of longue durée, which is the place of, I think that the concept of longue durée was elaborated in post-war years by Fernand Braudel, and it is also the mirror of what I call a frozen world. In the time of the Cold War, this is an essay written published in the early 50s. So at that time, where the word appears imprisoned, trapped into so compelling borders. History began to be thought in. So we could say with the tools of structuralism. So history becomes the longue durée. So becomes this vision of history as a superposition of layers, strata. So something which can be understood only in the long view. I think that was a reaction to a previous moment, the European Civil War, in which this vision was completely put into question, radically put into question. The first half of the 20th century is an age of sudden, radical, disruptive turns, and in which wars create a process of radicalization, a dynamic which clearly transcended its causes. So we cannot explain the world wars in terms of deterministic causality. And I think that after the Second World War, historiography tended to reproduce this kind of approach, of attitude. And so my attempt in my book was precisely to exhume and to rediscover history as a process which is not completely rationalized and understandable through so traditional categories, analytical categories. There is always something transcending these frameworks. Well, I don't know.
I think at this point, so if there are questions, so we can do a very last round. Andreas, you want to?
No. Just take the questions.
Please,
please go. I mean, very much look forward to reading the book with this very rich conversation too. I have a question about maybe a clarification about colonialism and the part that colonial experience plays in your book. Because you said that the main purpose, one of the purposes of the book is this relationship between violence, politics, culture in continental Europe between two world wars. And this is, I think, quite broad too. And I wonder, like, in what ways like, can you actually exclude the experience of colonialism from the history of that relationship, of that configuration between violence and politics in the continental Europe? Whether, I mean, it's not the question of just borders, but also like a historical experiential questions, epistemological questions, like what have you. And another thing is that just very, very short second one, about the definition of war, which I also find very, very interesting, this conflict of emotions and ideas and lots of things. But then, what is it that makes war a civil war? Within that definition, within your definition of war, it's a conflict of also ideologies, but also emotions. Can you kind of define, or can you distinguish civil war from war itself, that anthropological definition of war that you're talking about? And the third brief point is about that militarized paradigm of revolution that you're talking about. And this is, I think, a very, very, that there is this also tradition of writing about war communism and things like that. And I see that point is very, very relevant too. But I wonder, what is the addressee of that critique? Maybe social movements or party politics to some extent, but also maybe it is also partly because of the nation state that usually uses means of violence against any kind of radical formations or that are claiming for autonomy. So they are usually being repressed by violent means, just like in Turkey, right? And then the response is just intensification of militarized forms of politics in a way which does not leave any other avenues for action. So I kind of think that there is a more kind of a dialectical process here between the social movements and also the structures of power, which kind of give way to the persistence of this militarized paradigm of revolution.
Okay, now the challenge. So you have a question, please go ahead. And I was going to tell Professor Traverso that his challenge is to answer this in 2 minutes or something like that. But
yeah.
We increase the challenge. Please go ahead.
A short, perplexed question. Can you situate class struggle in terms of civil war, not only in a particular country as in Spain or Greece, but the longue durée of civil war, continuous wars? No one's used the term class struggle from another epoch or something. Or a dinosaur.
Okay, so very, very shortly. Colonialism. You know that one of the most debated questions in recent historiography, but it is a very old political debate. So the relationship between Nazism and colonialism. So many post-colonial interpretations of, or more than post-colonial, I would say, interpretations of Nazism suggested in the 50s by some thinkers who are today considered as forerunners of post-colonialism. I think to Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon. So Nazism is colonialism transferred to Europe, or the backlash is also the form used by Hannah Arendt, I think, and that's interesting. Nazi wars in Eastern Front was thought, planned, conceived as a colonial war. But a colonial war in the 20th century with the means of destruction of Germany in 1941. So, which are different with respect to the so-called small wars of British and French imperialism in the 19th century, in spite of their genocidal consequences. But so the way to carry on the war were completely different. But if this relationship between European civil war, fascism, and colonialism is retrospectively evident, I don't think we could say that the actors of this European crisis were conscious, were aware of that. I like always to. So I work with many categories borrowed from the tradition of the Frankfurt School. And I think that they are very pertinent in order to analyze, and also in order to produce a left theory of totalitarianism. But it's extremely it's fascinating, and we should try to this is a big interrogation. The entire tradition of the Frankfurt School and critical theory is completely blind with respect to colonialism. So, completely blind. So the word colonialism doesn't appear in books of Adorno, Benjamin. So, and from this point of view, we have, I think, to rediscover the tradition of this militarized paradigm of revolution.
More on this tomorrow, by the way.
Yeah, so the Baku...
The Constellations Conference.
The Baku Conference of 1920. This is with enormous contradictions and confusions with Armenians and Turks together, and Armenian nationalists and Turkish nationalists discussing. But this is the first moment in which the colonial world is apprehended by the left as a revolutionary subject, as a historical subject, and as a revolutionary subject. And this is an enormous historical change which announces colonial revolutions of the post-war. So from 1914 onwards, so 1945 onwards. So I think that during this period, in the interwar years, this question is completely evacuated by I would say by the mental habitus of the left. Not all of them, but so when in Paris we have the colonial exhibition, the surrealists and the Communist Party at that moment organized a kind of counter exhibition. So 3 million people to the first one, and 3,000 people to the second one. So anti-colonialism doesn't exist. And I finish on this point. Class struggle in those years take a military form. So that's the point. Precisely. Perhaps in the UK we can speak of class struggle, the general strike of 1926, which reproduces some traditional features in Europe. Class struggles between 1914 and 1945 is civil war. Is civil war carried on by political parties which are militarized parties. So I agree with George Mosse when he analyzes the brutalization of European language and culture by the First War, by the experience. So war enters very violently into society, cultures, and languages. So the Nazi lexicon has colonial roots on the one hand, and military roots on the other hand. So the language, and so when in my book I give a parallel. So the debates in the Third International, in the Comintern, on how to build revolutionary parties, Bolshevik parties in Western Europe, the strategic reflection of Gramsci, how to think the transition from war of position to war of movement. And there is a parallel very clear with a text like the Arbeiter of Jung. Of course, they are not the same thing. I'm certainly not assimilating them in terms of totalitarian ideologies. On the one hand, the communist criticism of social democracy, on the other hand, the fascist criticism of classical liberalism are present evident symmetries in an age in which classical liberalism appears like something belonging to a completely finished time. So there is always this retrospective anachronism. We project our vision, liberal democracy which exists today in that time. That time, liberalism appears as a vestige of the 19th century.
Thank you very much. Thank you.